interview with Ruth Marge Riordan, spelled Riordan. Marge lives at 3410 Oak Cliff, Lansing, 48917. Her phone number is area code 517-321-5222. The recording was made by Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center on November 16th, 1989. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Hey, Marge, maybe you would, if you would just start us with your name and your address and your phone number, please.
Okay. Marge Riordan, legally Ruth M. Riordan.
Okay.
3410 Oak Cliff, Lansing, 48917.
Okay.
321-5222.
All right.
Okay.
Do you live in Lansing all year round, or do you do travel?
Well, here and there, but the address,
The home address.
permanent address is Lansing.
All right.
Right.
Then, Marge, if you would just take us back to when you started at the plant.
Well, I started with General Motors in 1946.
All right.
I came out of the military, and I went to work at Fisher Body, and worked at Fisher Body from 1946 April until I left there. I was pregnant. I had gotten married when I was there and was pregnant for our first child, and left there in June of 1949. And then after Mike was born and I wanted to go back to work, Fisher Body didn't have a vacancy in their medical department. So there was a vacancy at Oldsmobile.
Now, you were trained as a nurse.
Oh, yes. I graduated from Sparrow Hospital in 1943.
All right. And your work at Fisher was in that?
In the occupational health, in the medical department at Fisher Body with Dr. Oshner. Okay.
He was the Fisher doctor.
He was a Fisher doctor, right? And
what did you do over there?
well, we had a main medical department and we had one first aid station that was manned a few hours a day.
All right.
But for the most part, all the people were seen in the main medical department, and that department was open 2 shifts.
Okay.
And so it was providing health care for the workers at Fisher Body, doing physicals, first aid, and the type of thing that I ultimately ended up doing over at Oldsmobile.
Okay.
And
were you on any particular shift at that time? Did you?
It was rotating shifts.
Oh, all right.
It was a rotating shift. Yeah. And of course, like every place, it was pretty much tied in with a line. I'm trying to think of what screwy hours we worked. There were some odd hours, like 5 to 1:42.
Oh, really?
That was the afternoon shift.
Interesting.
Yeah, 5 to 1.
Why was that?
It was line time, I suppose, to tie in with what ultimately,
Okay.
the bodies were going over to
Yeah.
Oldsmobile. And I suppose to tie in with the line time over there, or
Okay.
yeah.
That was just the hours that the plant was working.
And I suppose I think we had 42 minutes for lunch,
I'll be
for a
done.
meal. Now, maybe not.
Interesting.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I
Do you remember how many people were in the department at that
in the
time?
medical department at Fisher Body, I think that there were about 6 nurses and likely a couple clerical people and 1 doctor. That was Dr. Asher.
Okay.
Because the nurses back then, we did our own x-rays.
Okay.
We were trained in that. And from the standpoint of the people that we were servicing, I'm sure that was adequate help.
Okay.
Yeah. Small department. Yeah. We saw an awful lot of patients every day, though. Oh, yeah.
What kinds of things were happening?
Oh, you saw a lot of colds. You saw a lot of eye cases.
Oh, really?
Yes.
No glasses? People weren't?
Oh, even today, Jim, I don't think that entire Fisher Body wears safety glasses.
Isn't that
The
interesting?
first one of a patient of mine, I remember him coming in, and what he had done is pried up with something with a screwdriver The screwdriver slipped and he lost an eye.
Oh, God.
Yeah, yeah.
No glasses.
Uh-uh. I'm sure that some of their high injury areas, they have glasses today, but I imagine that some of Fisher Body still doesn't have glasses, unless with a change.
Yeah.
We've
So,
seen
so
some
the
other
early
things.
times were just a lot of
Trauma type of thing, a lot of eye cases, a lot of lacerations, contusions, fractures. I don't recall that we had that many falls. I don't recall that they did as much climbing as when I moved over to the Oldsmobile side, the employees were accustomed to. Maybe there were some, but very limited in number. And of course, Fisher Body was much smaller. The medical department that we had was down in the basement.
Okay.
Right by the employment office and right by personnel. And you went in off from Verlinden, not the entrance now, but there was one to the north.
All right.
And we went in there, and the medical department was down in the basement. Then when I wanted to go back to work, I went over there was an opportunity to go to Oldsmobile.
All right.
And that was in December 1949.
All right.
Dr. Steiner was there, and his associate was Dr. Place.
All right.
Bill Mahoney was the personnel director.
Okay.
Yeah. And I went, when I went to work, it was, I think that very limited training over there. I was supposed to go to work out in building 20 in the first aid, and the nurse was supposed to meet me out there and do the training. And I arrived, I remember asking plant security to let me in. This was in old building 20.
Okay.
This was a plywood first aid.
Yeah.
So I conducted business according to the Fisher Body way of doing business because there wasn't anybody there to tell me how to do it Oldsmobile way.
Okay.
Okay. And finally somebody showed up and I at least tuned into the way that they did it over on the other side. I worked in that first aid for, I can't recall. I'm trying to think of how long it was before they built a new one. See, this was in 49, and I believe at that time, Jim, there was 32 and 75 were then the final assembly area.
Right.
That had just been moved from that building, building 20 and 16
Yeah.
and 21A.
Yeah.
And they ultimately they enclosed an alley to build a better first aid, because that one that I was first assigned to was a plywood first aid.
Okay.
And I remember as you worked afternoons, the sun would come in one of those windows and it was just horribly hot. Yeah, we had all this, older equipment and so on. Well, then when they enclosed this alleyway or this open area, then they built a real nice first aid.
Okay.
So that would have been, I would think, in 50 or 51, because that was one of Dr. Steiner's goals, was to update all the first aid.
Okay.
The first one that was updated, I think, was the one in sheet metal in building 52. See, originally they were all plywood.
Isn't that interesting?
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Noisy. And then, of course, the new one was built over in 32, and that was a showcase.
Yes.
Then the one in 20 was enclosed or was improved upon. They closed over that open area. And then the last one to be changed was the one in 33. The present one that you now see.
And the main medical was where at that time?
The main medical was in buildings, as you and I agreed, building 60.
Okay.
Which they ultimately tore down.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was where the main medical was.
And you were whereabouts in that building? Where was that?
In the basement.
Okay.
I would have to think the southwest corner.
Okay.
Because adjacent to that was the employment office, and I suppose Tom Shields was someplace. Has he been in by?
No.
Okay. Would be salary personnel and so.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
All right.
but that was in the
So you're all
basement.
in the basement of 60 at the south end?
Southwest, yeah, because we opened off a parking lot.
Okay.
Okay.
That back parking lot.
Yeah, that was kind of between buildings, where current building 62 is,
Yeah.
and then that building, well, building 60 would have occupied a good share of that parking lot,
Yeah,
wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I know where you are.
Okay. Then, I'm trying to think of other improvements about that time. 1952 was when they opened that new plant hospital, building 62. That same year, plant 3 was opened. I can remember it because Eisenhower was elected. Okay. I had the opportunity, well, I had opened the first aid over in building 20, the new one, the brand new one. And then when plant 3 was being built, it was on my side of town. So I asked if I'd be sent over there, and I was sent over there in November of 1952.
All right.
And that first aid is the present one that you see. And also, I'm not sure about the exact time of when building 62 was opened, but it was opened, I think, that same year, or maybe 1953, early in 53. The 62 that we lived in for so many years. I stayed over at plant 3 for, well, let's see, I went there in 52, and then I left in 1956 because General Motors or Oldsmobile decided at that time that when salaried employees were pregnant, you must quit.
Slight change.
Slight change. I was pregnant in 1956, and I quit in October 1956.
All right.
And
had that been true with the first one too?
Oh no. It was corporate policy. You could take a pregnancy leave.
Okay, so in the 40s, then it
Yeah. No, this was something that the personnel director, Mr. Mahoney, was very adamant about. It's interesting that, let me see, Mike was 7 years older than Barbara. That I could be hired when our Michael was only 4 months old.
Yeah.
But then I wasn't the only salaried employee. Many salaried women lost time with Oldsmobile.
So that policy was a thing that occurred then in the 50s, sort of?
56. Yeah, I would say in the mid 50s somewhere,
All right.
because I originally had gone to Oldsmobile in 49.
Yes.
So this was mid 50s.
Yeah.
And it was a divisional policy. It was not a corporate.
Thing.
And it only applied to salaried women. It did not apply to hourly women because they were being granted pregnancy leaves. Interesting. Years later, there was some hubbub raised about this, and we were all granted 4 months onto our service time.
Oh, in essence, providing a leave for those times.
So most salary employees that were back working and pursued it, well, you picked up 4 additional months.
So I see.
Yeah. Which I think is rather interesting. I came back, during this interim of 1956 to 1960, I worked part-time for General Motors.
Okay.
I worked at Fisher Body during summer vacations. I worked at Oldsmobile and so on. And then I came back full-time in 1960. Thanks to Dr. Ralston and to Clarence Trump. I'm trying to think of where I went to work in 1960. I know where I went to work then. I went to work over in the motor plant.
Okay.
And interesting, at that time, I again started down at the bottom of the salary scale. From a vacation standpoint, it was just like a brand new hire.
Sure.
The only thing that wasn't brand new was at least my service time connected towards retirement, ultimate retirement. But you couldn't buy a car, the same old business that was based on seniority. I'm trying to think of all the years of working there. I worked in every medical aid station. See, the permanent ones there was plant 2, that was the forge plant, and that was the old plywood deal out in the What, in the press area or the foundry?
Hammer shop? Or?
Hammer, very close. Do you remember, do you have any information on that?
We have a lot of information on the horse plant from Bud Miller.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good, because I would think from the present first aid where it is now, it was like to the south.
Oh, all right. So you were in.
And it was on the main floor, on the first floor, and it was noisy, dirty. A complete medical department. They had an X-ray, they had a surgery, they had everything in it.
Really?
Oh yes, that was built during World War II.
All right.
Or at least it was revamped in that time. So that was very complete, but plywood construction. So the permanent facilities in the early 60s was Plant 3. The medical department is as you know it today. Plant 2, and of course, that is a new medical department. And at Plant 1, we had the first aid in Building 33, in Building 52, and the one over in 32, and the one in Building 20. And then the Plant Hospital at Building 62. Okay. Dr. Steiner, I would think likely went to the corporation about in I would think in the early 50s, because he was there when when all that remodeling was done in Building 62. So I would think he likely went in about 53, 54.
All right.
Dr. Place had gone by that time. He went down to Hydromatic. And I think perhaps was a medical director down there, because Dr. Ralston was the first one to come, and he and Dr. Steiner worked together for a period of time.
Okay.
And I couldn't tell you the number of years that they were together, but I would think not too many. And then when Steiner went to Detroit as corporate medical director, then Dr. Ralston was made medical director.
All right.
Of Oldsmobile. And Dr. Clark was one of the doctors that stayed the longest period of time. I think he was with us for about 9 years.
Okay.
And there were a number of other doctors that came and left. And then, of course, Dr. Phelan was there, working with Dr. Ralston. Dr. Austin was there, working there. There was a period during that time that there were 3 doctors.
Okay, this would have been about when, Mark?
I'm trying to think of a downturn in the economy. It happened in
1958 downturn.
No, it would have been later than that. Because Dr. Austin went over to Flint to work. I think it's 73.
Okay, sure, around the energy crunch.
Yep. So then we were down to 2 doctors,
Okay.
Dr. Phelan and Dr.
So in the 60s, we had 2 and then 3.
Yeah. I'm sure it was cyclical as the economy was up and down.
Yeah.
Usually we always had the 2 though.
Were the 2 doctors there at the same time, or?
Yeah. But what happened is one of them would go over to Plant 2 and Plant 3 and see patients over on the west side of town. And back in those days, our doctors were on call. I remember doctors and the call when somebody had some surgery to do, then they would either come to Plant 3 or Plant 2 on the afternoon shift and do the surgery. They were not sent out to the local emergency room.
What kind of things would you do for surgery?
Lacerations.
Sewing?
And they would come in, Dr. Steiner would come in, or Dr. Ralston would come in on off hours to do this type of thing. And
would you broken limbs, cast?
minor casts. Yeah. The nurses were trained to do x-rays, and we basically would interpret minor x-rays.
Okay.
And anything major, of course, went off to the hospital. We had an ambulance in those days.
All right.
That was plant security.
Mm-hmm.
And they would transport people to the hospital that would have to go. I'm trying to think of a funny that happened to me at Plant 2 and Plant 3. This was during the construction phase, and I got a phone call one day that somebody was buried. And you know what was going through my mind, somebody's buried and we're in a life and death situation. Yeah. And so I had called we had to use the township, and I think we did have our ambulance across town. So anyway, before I took off, I made the necessary calls, and I got down to the area and the person was buried to their knees. So you can imagine how I felt. And I remember saying to Clarence Trombley, who was my supervisor, boy, my face red, and he said, well, you were preparing for the worst, and you really do when you get that kind of information. You would have to be buried to the knees. Buried to the knees. Because during a construction phase of a building, and I remember a couple of incidents over there at Plant 3 where contractors had fallen. I remember having to go up a ladder up to the high area in the plating area, way up to the second or third levels. And somebody had fallen way from the roof area down and hit a guardrail on, I suppose, the third level up there. Oh my goodness. And they literally had to bring him down by ladder. So you never knew in a construction area what was going to be happening. Interesting times, isn't it? I'm trying to think of other interesting things from the older medical situations. One of the nurses asked me to be sure and remember to tell that Dr. Steiner was always the one that, he said he did a lot of excellent surgery. Oh, that man did beautiful surgery. Dr. Ralston did beautiful surgery. I remember Dr. Steiner used to do amputations that would happen, And not too many things were sent out in those days. Different laws have come into effect, and different skills and more administrative duties, so on. The background, let's see. Trying to think about when Plant 4 came under our umbrella. I suppose that would have been in the early 60s. Right. 59 or 60, would have been probably 60. Right. Because Clarence was still there. I must talk about Clarence too. Clarence Trombley had gone to work, I think, at Oldsmobile in the early 30s. Back in those days, there were male nurses. That was kind of unusual, wasn't it? Unusual opportunities for nurses. They had company aid men too. Right. Okay. Because when I went there in 49, I was working the opposite shift from a fellow by the name of Flack Headley. We were up in 21. Yeah. Some other company aid men. There was a Jack London that worked over in building 50. There was Bill Day, who had come out of the military. I think he had worked there prior to going into World War II, and then when he came back to his same position. During World War II, his wife, who was a nurse, took his position at Oldsmobile. Yeah. How did they differ from what you were doing? Not very much. Not very much. In fact, they had tremendous skills. Because more of our thrust in the early 50s or the late 40s was on triaging or treatment of injuries. They were crackerjacks. They were crackerjacks. I'll never forget Bill. Bill never learned how to bandage a finger anyway, but with that old roller bandage. And he could bandage a finger like you can't believe. He did a beautiful job. So these men were extremely good. I remember at the time, and Jacqueline was on, and that this happened, a man had an arm amputated out in Press Metal. And a friend of mine who was an RN happened to be on. Often these serious things happen on overlapping shifts. The Lord always looked out after the medical department.
Mm-hmm.
And she told me afterwards, she said, I could not believe how well this man handled that. You know, he had very good skills. They had excellent skills. So our employees were well taken care of, even though these men perhaps did not have the same training that the nurses did.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a lot of empathy skills. They had a lot of, and the employees trusted them. I think about, see, the one aid station that was open around the clock was the one in Sheet Metal in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
And everything plant-wide was brought there, or they took the nurse
Okay.
from there. And so those gentlemen handled emergencies very well. They handled a lot of things very, very well.
Was that one the one that was open all the time because that's where more things happen?
And think about Press Metal. All the presses there, all the serious accidents. It was kind of a precedent-setting type of thing. We would see other aid stations as volume increased. You know, they may put on an extra shift. I remember a third shift going on over in the motor plant.
Oh, yeah.
Because there was a lot of activity there.
Mm-hmm.
We never had a third shift over in 32 in the assembly area. We would, the nurses would work 10 hours, our line time.
Yeah.
The first aid in building 20, the nurses worked 10 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But as Dr. Steiner was there, and then Dr. Ralston, when there was an opportunity for additional help to be put on, it was not, I mean, they always gave the opportunity to register nurses. So as the company aid men, or the men that were trained on the job, retired or whatever reason, then they were replaced by registered nurses.
Okay.
I have seen, Jim, I always felt as I rubbed elbows with my peers throughout the corporation, Oldsmobile and the vision of the medical directors at Oldsmobile was a vision that supported the upward rating of the medical department, encouraged nurses to do more, and hired more qualified help and did more training type of a situation. Of course, that was the whole thrust of life, but it came earlier on, I would say, in the medical
I
department.
see.
Yeah, very definitely. Because I remember being supported along this line, and I can't say enough about Clarence Trombley supporting along this line. We, again, had a vision of what can we do for education for nurses. And we started the local Lansing Occupational Health Nurses Group.
All right.
And that was started back in the early 50s.
Okay.
But that provided some additional opportunities for nurses in occupational health. Back in those days, it was called industrial health, or industrial nurses, to meet with their peers and to have seminars appropriate for occupational health, which I think is really interesting. Because it is different. Nurses now in occupational health wear different hats. We wore a lot of different hats back in those days, but it grew. This field grew. As you think about, you're rubbing elbows with occupational health nurses and how I'm sure you know that they were a chaplain, they were a counselor, they were a mother, they were a father, they were a nurse, they were a doctor, you name it. They were a mental health expert. Really, the field has grown tremendously. And I guess that's what as I look back here in 1946, coming out of the military and going to work at Fisher Body, not seeing so much of it there because we were encompassed in one area.
Okay.
But as you got, then when I went to work at Oldsmobile, the medical aid stations, of being able to, it was a one-to-one situation. You were out there on your own. And the employees tended to look to the nurse on duty for different, if no more than counseling or no more than this is what's happened at home.
Interesting.
Yeah, can you give me some?
Okay.
Yeah, the listening ear, the employees that concerned about a child. I was in those days from a healthcare system. Not as much as was available then through newspapers. And I remember somebody coming in, a child is sick. Who do you suggest? You could suggest names of your doctors in the area. But the nurses, we had a special spot. Believe me, in our role as a nurse out in the plant at Oldsmobile, you were well respected. You were, always had all kinds of cooperation. You were a friend. And I still see that today. I think it may be a different thrust, but that goes along with the times. That goes along with the times.
Did you have any of the nurses that had a problem with the industrial environment?
Oh, yes.
Where it didn't work so well? It's a lot different, I assume.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There were nurses that didn't like it at all. They didn't like that opportunity to be an individual and to make your own decisions. We had guidelines, Jim. We had procedure manuals. And this was very detailed. So you would know what the policy was. And you had a real good orientation. I think for the most part, in later years, our nurses had like a 2-week orientation.
Okay, because you had mentioned when you started, you didn't.
No,
really.
didn't have anything. No.
There you are.
Yeah, there I was. But in later years, we were able to give two weeks. And that was extremely good.
And all of these folks did come to you with their normal nursing training.
Yes. They were all registered nurses. And I know Clarence would tend to hire nurses that had a strong background, perhaps in surgery, in emergency room,
All right.
in medical surgical fields. And as I became a supervisor there, of course, you could start looking for people that had previous occupational health nursing experience, but also you looked for people that had emergency room surgery experience, because they would tend to make real crackerjacks of in the occupational health nurse field. They were extremely good. But there were nurses that did not want the independence that occupational health provided.
Did the plant atmosphere cause any peculiar, I don't mean the air, but just you're dealing in a different kind of an industrial situation, greasy, grimy, dirty, noisy, and all that stuff.
I'm sure that I would tend to think that it was more, they didn't want to be by themselves.
All right.
I remember a real good nurse quitting, and she said and she'd worked maybe for a couple of years, and she said, I want to be around more nurses. I don't like being out there by myself.
I see.
In later years, we got emergency buttons out there. In case you had an emergency and you couldn't get to a telephone, even though we had telephones in the medical aid stations. And those were helpful.
What did those do?
Well, they rang directly into plant security, and security would immediately come. Because, somebody could, you might be in a situation where somebody could die and you're by yourself. Can you leave the patient? That was more, fortunately, the unusual. Covered plant 4. Plant 5, you know about when that started. I'm trying to think of when we started that in the early.
What would have been
That's
like,
in the late 70s?
yeah, 79.
79,
Yeah.
okay. I'm trying to think of when I became a supervisor.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. I became a supervisor likely mid-70s.
All the previous time you had been.
A staff nurse, right. And somewhere along the line, I was moved over to the plant hospital and I was working over there. It was at about the time that Clarence Trombley retired. Rex Bangs had come into
Okay.
he was in the medical department, and Harold Cutler at that time was a personnel director. And of course, Harold was one of the old guard that believed that women still didn't have any place in.
Oops.
That he's dead, isn't he? You can delete that one. Yeah. So anyway, when Clarence retired, Rex Bangs was made supervisor of the medical department, and I was made head nurse. Okay. And I don't know, maybe that went on for a couple of years, and then they started the employee assistance program. By that time, and Jim Lewandowski was into the picture. He was assistant personnel director. And so when that all happened, and I think maybe by that time Jim was personnel director when employee relations was started. So Rex was moved to employee relations. I was made supervisor of the medical department, and Rosemary Fowler was made my head nurse. And that would have been in the late 70s.
All right. What was the assistance program?
Employee assistance,
Yeah.
the alcohol program.
All right.
Strictly the alcohol program at that time.
Prior to that,
There was nothing.
if you had a person, what did we do?
They would meet with a medical director, and there was very little within the community to help the person that had an abuse problem.
All right.
Very little.
Just ultimately, you just.
Yeah, they went
the
along the, yes. I think a lot of people were fired. Maybe some people did get some help for their problem, and there were some, perhaps some heroin addicts that we had out in the plant that we knew little or nothing about. It was likely in the late 70s that more emphasis was put on employee assistance. And I think, again, Oldsmobile was one of the leaders in this area. Rolly Austin. Okay. Rolly Austin. I'm trying to think, and Jim Richards had been in that program originally. And Rolly must have been moved off to Detroit to work on the corporate program, and that's when I think Rex Bangs was put into the employee assistant program. Okay, there was one prior to Rex's going there. Yep. And
the purpose of that program was basically to
assist the people to treatment and to confront the people that had the alcohol problem or the abuse problem.
But to try and rehabilitate folks.
Yes,
is that what we were attempting?
Yes. Get them to treatment and then bring them back into the work situation, and to do some follow-up to keep them in the work situation.
All right.
It was, it's an extremely good program. We, again, with the close working relationship, and I think that at that time, the employee assistant person reported to the medical director. There was a time they reported to the not the personnel director, labor relations person. So I can't recall how this, so it was back and forth. We were able additionally to provide the nurses with an opportunity to spend some time in that program, to learn more about it, and to be more effective as they went out into the medical aid stations. Again, because they were in a prime position to perhaps confront an employee who had a drinking problem. That was where the action really begins. And so there was a great thrust to educate. I think we gave the nurses 3 months in that area to learn how the program was run, to really be more effective. My experience as a supervisor was interesting because of course, always by that time, the supervisor was responsible for the new medical aid stations. Where it was no longer the medical director's responsibility, or, the medical director was sitting here and the supervisor was out doing it. So I had my finger in the pie in the one in Building 90 and at Plant 5. When that one was started, why the plant was open, we had a nurse out in a trailer for a period of time before the first aid was really open. And that was interesting for the nurse that worked out there. I additionally worked with plant layout and for the new one in Building 20. Because I can't recall when the first aid was torn out of Building 20 or 21A, but they needed some room. I suppose it was for the, what's up in that area?
That's where that HGVS thing.
And then they were going to have the RIM process going up there. So more people were working in that area. And I think perhaps with a contract, management agreed to build a new first aid, which is the present one right above plant security. So it's interesting how in that particular area, 1949, we started with a plywood one. Then they enclosed an open area like an alleyway for another one. They tore that out because that was never going to be needed again. This is an old building and likely it'll go and they'll never need that. So now they've come full circle. Now they have another first aid, still in the same old building. Other aid stations, I think that about covers it, except the move to HRC.
Oh, okay. True. We left, didn't we?
Yes. Well, in 1980, there were 5 people that retired from the medical department. Dr. Ralston retired, and we had our last medical aid person, Bill Day, retired, and then we had 3 nurses that retired. Rosemary Fowler, who was my head nurse, and Evelyn Haas and Pauline Ketch. Now, this was in 1980, and this was the first time, I believe, that a mass exodus of people began. Dr. Wills was made medical director.
Had he been there?
Yes, he came in 1970, I think in about 1977, 78. So then it was Dr. Wills and Dr. Austin that ran the medical. And then we had 3 nurses that retired in 1982. There was a little downturn, and again the door opened for people that fit certain categories to retire, and 3 took advantage of that. I'm trying to think of when Dr. Austin might have retired. Can't recall. Maybe in 1980.
All right.
And there were times during this whole deal that often a medical director would be on their own. They would not have an associate, which is really, when you think about that large number of employees, you think about how difficult it must have been. And this is where we started using more referrals or outside needs. In other words, the eye cases would go off to the eye doctor.
All right. Is it now? This is different philosophy than previously.
And it was born of a need of, here's maybe only one doctor, and there was no way that one doctor could do everything. even though we may have had the facilities. Male nurses could do physicals, female nurses could do physicals. So that was no problem, but the treatment of the emergency cases that the medical, that our doctors had previously done, when there was a shortage of the doctors, that's when we started using emergency rooms or specialists on the outside.
Had we stopped doing what I would call your operation kinds of things and all? And
Oh, yes, we had stopped doing that. Oh, I suppose perhaps in the mid-60s or something
all right.
like that.
So that was an earlier.
That was an earlier. Things were getting more sophisticated, and our doctors were not coming out at night.
Oh,
That was another thing,
all right.
and I can't recall how that all began to fit into the picture, but I'm sure that as you would have, it seems that as you would have downturns, then as things started swinging up, perhaps the swing up didn't meet the needs. I mean, the medical, the doctors were not there to meet the needs of the swing up.
Okay.
I guess I would have to say, yeah, the peaks and valleys.
You took people away during the valleys, did you?
On some occasions, sure. Nurses might have, I was laid off for 3 weeks, and I'm trying to think of when that was. That must have been in the 60s somewhere.
Okay.
But needs were different as the peaks and valleys were there.
Okay.
I was used to say to employment as we were in a peak, can't you ever schedule physicals 10 a day and not have to do 60 a day? And we were always doing it. We were always playing catch up. It was never, you could never build a bank. It was either feast or famine.
How would you ever do 60 in a day?
By awfully hard work and getting some extra people in or working people overtime. But that was, I used to say to Orland Bender, isn't there a better way we can do it? And I think I said the same thing to Bill Clevenger. And, well, they need them now out in the plant. You know that concept, I'm sure, Jim.
Yeah.
They need them now. And as I look back, they have not had a hiring program since 1984. As we know, a hiring program, a mass hiring. But those were difficult times because you had to get the number through there, not the number, but, well, you needed so many people.
Sure. What did a physical entail, just out of curiosity?
You did a complete medical history, you did a vision, you did a hearing, you did urine screening, blood pressure, chest x-ray, and then laying on of the hands. And if people were going into certain high-risk areas, they would have a pulmonary function test. So it would take a lot of time.
Did that change over those years from the 40s up into the 70s?
Well, okay, in the late 50s, the importance of monitoring a worker's hearing started arriving on the horizon. And there was a time that we, and I think again, Oldsmobile was one of the leaders in this particular area. It was more attuned at that time to doing, we'll do a hearing test when they come in, when they hire in. And there was a certain criteria that had to be met. And that changed over a period of years. In the 60s was when, I believe it was in the 60s that the Occupational Health and Safety Act arrived on the scene. And that was when it was mandated that industry monitor the hearing of employees working in 90 dB or higher. And for quite a number of years, we had a hearing trailer. And we had 2 nurses that operated a hearing trailer, and that was moved to various parts of the plant. And then in a downturn, that was eliminated because we needed the nurse help someplace else. And other means of monitoring hearing were looked at. And today, the ways of monitoring hearing is they have audiometers out in the medical aid stations. And on a yearly basis, the hearing of the workers is monitored. And it is anybody working in 85 decibels and above, I think, is monitored.
And you just put everybody through there on a yearly basis.
That's, to my knowledge, at least when I left in 1987, that was the case.
In the 40s, in the early 50s, there was no
Nothing.
nothing about that. That was
Nothing
kind
about
of a new
That
problem.
That's right. They hadn't realized what noise did to hearing and how it really impacted on the workers or on anybody's
Yeah.
hearing. When you think about World War II and all those workers, all those workers of Oldsmobile that were likely in the military and would not have worn hearing protection. It was, well, they didn't know the effects.
But there must have been like the forge plant guys that were kind of historically always.
Oh, yes. Yes, you are right. And they were the first ones that I think really were tested. We used to send those people down to Henry Ford Hospital.
Oh, really?
To monitor their hearing. That was where a very good hearing program was in effect. And we even brought those employees that had lost a lot of hearing aids, because they showed a tremendous amount of hearing loss, particularly the ones that operated the hammers, and learned a lot over a period of years. I had forgotten about the hearing program. Other programs that were started during my term. I mentioned employee assistance. We mentioned the hearing program.
Did a little bit on the employee assistance back in the 40s and the 50s. Prior to that, was alcohol more or less of a problem than later?
I think that likely we just didn't know as much about it. We didn't know what we were looking for.
Didn't recognize
it. I remember the story of a little old man, and that was when I first went to work there, and he must have been a drinker. He had they had a large family, and his check via the personnel department was given directly to his wife.
to keep him out of the bar, so to speak.
So, but in a smaller company, and I have no idea of plant population in those days. I would imagine, I'm just taking a rough guess, it was likely 10,000 or under, maybe back in the late 40s. And then look at how much it grew. So everybody knew everybody in the 50s, or they knew them in a different way. They know them differently today. It's a different generation. Back in those days, we were dealing with the generation that knew the wars and the Depression.
True.
Like the Massey tapes. But alcohol was still a problem. But I think a lot of people just didn't make it to work, and perhaps supervision was aware that somebody had a drinking problem, but we had no program. Other programs that were started, the employee assistance, the hearing, the blood pressure screening program. That was in more recent years, and that was tied in the corporation.
Why did that start?
because they saw a relationship between high blood pressure and coronary artery disease. And they felt it would cut down, I'm sure, on medical costs and save a lot of costs later on for early retirements and so on. And I'm sure that it did. And it was a very good program, because we were able to help a lot of people recognize the fact that they had blood pressure problems. Another program that was started many, many years before, and I can't remember the date, was the tetanus program.
All right,
That was during Clarence Trombley's time.
okay.
Our plan was to immunize everybody out in the plant. And of course, anybody that had been in the military was already immunized.
Mhm.
But there were a lot of people that were working that had never been immunized. And it's so important for those that were outdoor workers or where they might come in contact with the dirt or animal excreta.
Yeah.
So that was another program that we started. We had during the
So the goal there was to inoculate everybody in the shop?
It's kind of a public health service. Back in the early 50s, there was a mass screening of everybody to find out their blood type.
Oh,
And I think that may have been related to some fears of the post-war type of a situation, because we all had little plastic cards.
all right.
We additionally, I'm kind of rambling, we
That's all right.
additionally had the swine flu program, which we were involved with in sometime between 74 and 75, 76, somewhere in there during Ford's administration.
What were you trying to do with that?
Well, this was I would imagine the United States Public Health Service felt that there was a great need to immunize as many people in the United States against the swine flu virus that was likely coming from some foreign shore, and the corporation bought into it.
Okay.
And in fact, it's the state of Michigan. There were some deaths from swine flu,
Okay.
from the vaccine, I think. We were fortunate we did not have any problems.
Once again, trying to inoculate everybody in the plant?
Or make it available to as many that wanted it.
Okay.
Because as I recall, there were also community clinics that were available to people. The corporation has really directed their divisions, I believe, towards working with the community on health matters. We certainly saw it with the safety department and the environmental environment. Other programs, I'm trying to think if there were any other programs. There were always opportunities, or in more recent years, for students to come in and spend some time maybe with nurses in the medical department. I know I was able to provide this opportunity for some of the nurses that were out at Michigan State going through their
Like summer intern programs, that sort of thing.
Right. And that was a very meaningful opportunity, I'm sure, for those nurses. And I'm not sure if they still do that or not. I know they were still doing it when I left.
Did the nurse make, well, he or she hired in the morning?
In the 40s, when I went to work at Fisher Body, I made $150 a month. Okay. That was in 46. I think we got night shift premium. Maybe we didn't get it at that time. We were limited to working only 54 hours a week
Oh, really?
in those days, yes.
So that was true of all women or just?
All women.
All women were limited. Okay.
That swung up and down, and I'm trying to think of when it may have changed, because then it seems to me like there was a time that we were able to work more, and then it again went down. But now it's a wide open.
Did the company provide you with the white uniforms and those kinds of
Not
things? Or
for,
is that
um,
something that you had to do?
we did that for a period of time and they would launder them for us. And then as more, as the newer fibers came in, where laundry wasn't that difficult. Somewhere along the line, we were able to have the company buy the uniforms
Oh,
and we would launder them.
all right.
Okay. Because I remember that was when Clarence was a supervisor there for years and years and years. I think he must have retired in the early 70s. And it seems to me like when he retired, he had 35 to 40 years.
Mhm.
At that time, it seemed to me like that was a long time. And then when I retired, 38 years in. So it must not have been such a long time after all.
All relative.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah, yeah.
Did, over that span of time, Marge, the approach to healthcare changed not only there, but nationally, and the knowledge that we had on various subjects changed. Can you just maybe summarize how that effect happened in the plant? What went on? Machinery and equipment and sophistication and that sort of thing, and maybe you could just.
Okay.
With Ruth Marge Riordan of 3410 Oak Cliff, Lansing, 48917. The recording was made by Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center on November 16th, 1989. This is tape number 2 of 2 tapes. The changes in the medical field must have had some effect on the plant too, from the standpoint of machinery and equipment and medicines. And can you kind of just paraphrase how that might have happened and what might have changed there?
Well, I think from when I first went to work there, likely a greatest percentage of the people that we would see would have been what we would consider emergencies or something that needed taken care of right now. However, we did provide a service of somebody came in with a cold while we had a routine type of treatment for colds and sore throats and so on. We always had oxygen. Even way back in when I went to work there in the 40s, oxygen was available. We had x-rays. The x-ray unit, there was one at the plant hospital, there was one at plant 2 and at plant 3.
Mm-hmm.
And from a medication standpoint, we had pretty much standardized medicine that we could give out in the medical aid stations. If the nurse in the medical aid station, and this has not changed this much, felt that an employee needed to be seen by the doctor, then they were sent either to the plant hospital, or if you were working at plant 2 or plant 3 at that time, then you would have them come in to see the plant doctor when he made his triple. There were different medications were available in those units where you were dispensing something out upon their order. There have been medications that you would have what we call standing orders for. In other words, you could use your own discretion, and there was an order that the medical director had written out to cover this particular situation. For a cold, you gave so many pills, or you did such and such a thing for a cold, or you could, if you felt that something more serious was happening, that's when you would exercise the sending the employee home
Okay.
to see their own family doctor. So you were like the in-between. The employee hadn't, at that time, they knew it was important for them to get to work. They maybe shouldn't have been in the work environment, but they had come. And so then the next recourse would be to go to the medical aid station to see the nurse. And if the nurse felt that they were sick enough to go home, then that particular thing happened. From the emergency standpoint, or from the treatment of emergency things, we saw a lot of lacerations, but lacerations were treated. We used an awful lot of tape sutures back in those days when I first went into industry. And we did a real fine job with tape sutures. I think they still use them some, but likely not to the degree that we used them back then. The equipment, like the way of giving oxygen or the sophisticated aspect of the equipment, is different today. In a lot of the medical aid stations, they have a unit that is can talk back to the nurse to tell them what to do. In other words, it's a heart aid, and it will even deliver automatic CPR if somebody has gone into cardiac arrest, or it will defibrillate a patient. So that is new. Intravenous solutions are available out in the medical aid station. They were not back in those days. We did not have them available. It seems to me that in the late 40s and early 50s, perhaps, we didn't see the real value to it. And it was likely there, and we just didn't see it. Trying to think of the suctions that really hasn't changed that much. It doesn't seem like. The x-rays, I mentioned those. The medications become more sophisticated with the times. Of course, the antibiotics were out there. From the standpoint of ordering antibiotics, it would be in a very limited scope that the nurse would work on their standing orders. Of course, the doctor was available to. We've seen some changes in eye cases because with the use of, they always wore safety glasses, but then with putting shields on, or in the plating area at Plant 3, as they were working in the tanks, they wore additional goggles, because there was a time prior to wearing goggles there that we were seeing a lot of bad eye burns from solutions. And so the safety aspect came in there. And I think that's where the medical department works so closely with the safety department on improving the environment for the worker. If the nurse saw a pattern developing, you knew the safety person was around, and you could always share it with them. And they had their ears open all the time. There were people that had a lot of insight into improving things. So you work very closely with the safety department. And I'm sure that a lot of the serious accidents that we knew back in the 50s were eliminated by better equipment out in the plant, more attention to the safety aspect of it. You do see developing, and this happened even before I had left, the repetitive injuries, the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the hand injuries, from doing certain repetitive jobs over and over and over, like up and down with the arm or holding the wrist in a flexed bent area.
Those weren't prevalent back in the,
We did not, if they were, we didn't recognize them. We would see some back cases, yes.
Sure.
We saw quite a few back cases, but they didn't have the good hoists back in those days. I would have to, I remember asking the doctors, why did they feel that we were seeing so many more like hand injuries in the more recent years when the assembly line was operating 95 cars an hour? We didn't seem to be seeing so many of those. And they felt that it was because when you were putting 95 cars an hour down the line, an employee was only doing one job. So when you lowered that line speed, they were having to do several jobs. And they felt that that likely had made a difference. Yeah, because today you likely see many more carpal tunnel.
yes, I don't think they ever heard of that, did they?
No.
Yeah.
But the sad thing, as I see it, back when I was there and we had already begun to see carpal tunnels, the manufacturers of tools were not paying any attention. And they were not paying any attention to the fact that I'm left-handed and somebody else is right-handed. I am a left-handed person, and I was always dulling the scissors in the medical aid station because I was turning them upside down. And you do hold things differently. Women need a smaller tool than what men do. And I think now the manufacturers are beginning to pay attention to this because of so many billions and billions of dollars that are being spent on trying to make hands better and so on. I do see, or it seems to me that oftentimes the wrong persons were being consulted about what would work best for the employee. It did not happen back in, it was just there. If the engineer decided this is the way it was going to be done, why, here's the little 5-foot person, that's that person's job, and stand on your tippy toes. Those have changed, I'm sure. Ergonomics has come into ergonomics is so visible now. We always felt, or we felt for a good many years, that Oldsmobile had a very good history as far as taking care of their employees and the sick, the use of sick benefits and not sick benefits being abused. I think that we had an ideal way back in the days that I was there of monitoring it. They came through the medical department to be put on sick leave, and for the most part, we were able to monitor pretty well their absences. And then, of course, they came back through the medical department. A lot of this has changed at this point in time. I don't know what their history is as far as health costs.
Did you get people that were chronic sickies?
Oh, yes. You would do that in any environment, I'm sure.
Did we have a way of handling those kinds of cases?
Well, there was an independent medical examination that was established by management and the union to send employees that perhaps there was some question about to an outside independent examiner.
Was that a kind of a more recent happening? Did we do that in the 40s and early?
I would say, I really don't know. I'm guessing that perhaps that might have started in the 60s,
All right.
late 60s. There's been a different relationship with the union and the medical department.
Did you see that change?
Oh, yes. Oh,
What did you
yes.
see?
Oh, it seemed to me when I first went, I remember saying to my supervisor, will there never be a time when they will not always ask for something more? Don't they ever have to give back to the company? Because that was what I saw during those years. It seemed like every contract, it was more demands, more demands, more demands. And it seemed to me that they were always given. However, in the more recent years, and it was before I left, this began to change. The economic thing made it change. Yes, the economic thing made it change. I would think that in the 60s, there was or in my time, even from the very beginning in industry, there was almost an adversarial role because we were trying to protect the confidentiality of our patient, which is so important to us.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that their feeling was that they were also trying to protect what they felt was their obligation to the employee. And there could be conflict. But it's interesting that it has changed.
All the medical records, Marge, that we collected over the years, did we just kept all that, so to speak? It
As far as I know, it was when I left.
was a permanent file on each page, or-
I don't know if it had always been the corporate guidelines that you did not destroy any of that information. You didn't destroy any x-rays.
Oh, really?
Mm-mm.
So you kept,
Yeah,
all of
x-rays. Now, I don't know if they had microfilmed them. I think that was acceptable. At least certain x-rays.
you mentioned that we gave everybody a chest x-ray.
Back in the early days, yes. Oh, yes. We used to do what we called 4x5 x-rays. And then there came this edict out, and I'm sure it came from the United States Public Health Service, that they felt that people were getting more radiation with the little x-rays than they were with the big
Oh, yeah.
x-rays. They do not take x-rays as often as we did in those days. We used to follow people that had tuberculosis and tuberculosis exposure. I have to think about that. In the 50s, as somebody out in the plant came down with tuberculosis and they had worked around a given number of employees, then the state health department notified us, and we would follow the contacts that they had. And that was another public health service. We additionally used to do for years, we did what you call blood cons that were always done on new hires. We routinely did blood cons. This is to pick up syphilis.
Oh, okay.
And those were run through the health department. They no longer do that. And I don't know whether that is even a requirement anymore through when somebody gets married. I'm not sure whether it's any longer a state requirement. I don't know.
You mentioned blood. I think of blood drive.
Oh, yes, blood drives, blood drives. That came into the focus through the Red Cross.
All right.
And that was handled by the medical department.
Okay.
Because a young fellow that worked in the medical department worked on the blood drives. And then they were set up in certain areas of the plant and certain times of the year. And this helped the community.
Did those exist back in the 40s when you first came?
No.
Oh,
I'm trying to think of when they may have started. Would just be a guess, Jim. Maybe in the 70s.
oh, really?
They still have blood drives. I understand that this is under the umbrella now of the union. The programs we've had.
Hey, Margie, when did you say you retired?
1987,
87.
August of 87. Yeah. And
The x-ray thing is maybe a little bit off the wall. Back in the old days, people didn't worry much about x-rays, and the nurses that ran the x-ray machines, they were sort of right out there with it, weren't they?
well, you were always behind a shield.
So,
You're behind a shield.
so people, but were people worried about?
Oh, no,
radiation and
no,
that sort of
no,
stuff in those days?
no, No, when I think about all the hullabaloo of radiation now, and I suppose that, and it's changed an awful lot.
Mhm.
Because I remember taking x-rays when it's a skill that I learned, and I was pregnant at the time.
Mhm.
That one's an operating a submarine, so I guess everything's all right. Yeah. So things have changed. Medicines have changed. That from the x-ray standpoint, the protection to the patient
Okay,
is the thing that has changed.
oh, all right.
Likely the units have changed somewhat. But the unit that was moved over to HRC had been in building 62 since we opened in, well, no, I think they'd gotten a new one in. But part of it, I would imagine the table or some portion of it had been there for a good many years. But things become more sophisticated. And they do not take as many x-rays.
Okay.
Yeah, I noticed this even before I left. Well, it's my understanding that the x-ray unit is still at plant 3, but it's non-functional. It's just occupying space. Another thing that has happened, as the plants, even though they were quite far apart and the medical aid station was, say, a distance away, when you had an emergency, why you usually walked down there or got down there as soon as possible, or somebody would pick you up on a scooter. And now at plant 3 and at plant 5, they have their own emergency cart that they take out to the area. But when you think about the widespread area, it's a very handy unit to have. Everything's available, and once they get the call, they can start the cart and be on their way in a very short period of time.
Has that changed much over the years? Did the nurses in the early days get out on the?
Oh, yes, at Oldsmobile, we always got called out. It had been standard operating procedures. And as I get together with my peers now, we laugh about when somebody had to go down into a pit or somebody told Superintendent X to shut down the line because I can't get this patient out of here. And that was bad news, to Superintendent X to shut down the line. Yeah, we all laugh about these type of things. If there were different needs and different demand on the medical department with different areas of the plant. When I think of plant 3, and I worked there I worked there a total of around 4 years. The needs were different. The nurse had different duties than the nurse over on the assembly area. Many different duties. The assembly line nurses, theirs was a busy world, and oftentimes we put extra help in there because they were so busy at certain times.
Problems out there.
A lot of problems, or we often want, I used to say, I think the word goes out that the nurse is busy, and so everybody's going to come down and make sure that they get a little bit of extra rest. That first aid has been changed out in the assembly area from where it originally was. And that was changed because in putting a different line in, they tore out the old first aid and put a new one in. When I think about the waste of money, and I don't know whether we should talk about this, I think about that, and maybe there was a reason for doing it. I think about tearing out the first aid up there in building 20 and then building another one. However, it's a nicer one and likely it's more accessible. I remember a funny on me when I was at 3, and we had these empty tanks that had been used in our X-ray area. They'd been around for a long, long time. And as you stumble over things, or they're always around, why someday you take it upon yourself to just get rid of them. And I don't think that likely more, and I was the one that got rid of them, and I don't think that more than a week elapsed and Clarence called and wondered where these tanks were. Well, the nurse on another shift got that information, and so I had to call him since I was the one that was guilty. And he said, well, what did you do with the tanks? And I said, well, I gave them to the janitor to get rid of. And, try and find the tanks. Well, needless to say that in my estimation, they were useless. They had to be repaired, and he thought they could be repaired. Well, I couldn't find them. So that was some more waste of money, I guess you might say, Jim. But things really have changed over a period of time. Highlights of some years. I remember when Douglas MacArthur came through the plant back in the early 50s after the Korean War.
Okay.
And he was, I remember him riding in an Oldsmobile in a convertible, and they brought him down through behind building 16A and between 75 there.
Mm-hmm.
Years later, when I was visiting his museum down in Norfolk, Virginia, I saw this silver plate piece that had been donated to Douglas MacArthur by Oldsmobile Division. I additionally remember Christmas parties, and this would have likely been in the late, maybe it was early 50s, where there was an Oldsmobile that was up on the stage when the women's club had their Christmas party, and some lucky person was going to win that car.
Mm-hmm.
That was during the time of Mr. Wolfram.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my understanding that also the executive club received a car, as did the hourly workers.
Okay.
And I can't remember how many years this went on, but maybe 3, 4, or maybe it was only 2. But what a beautiful party! What a beautiful party!
Did the ladies have a different party than the men?
Oh yes, oh yes. And we always had 2 parties a year. We had one at Christmas and we had one in June.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the department head was invited because Dr. Ralston or Dr. I think it was more Dr. Ralston. I remember him going to many of these parties. I remember originally when I went to work at Oldsmobile, and this would likely have been in the early 50s, we had to pay for our tickets to go to the parties.
Oh, really?
But in those days, we didn't know any different, and that was okay because it was such a nice party.
Yeah.
And additionally, the women's club or the girls' club that it was known in those days, we used to have a lot of outside activities. They would take us up to Grand Haven. To the beach. We'd have a Saturday at the beach, or we went down on St. Clair Lake St. Clair. There were a lot of different activities like that to promote togetherness, to promote knowing the peers that you were working with.
But it was always just the ladies.
Yeah, there were a few men that went along to do the cooking of the food or something like that, or maybe the person that was in charge of the recreation department. There was a recreation department for years, and perhaps that person would go, and maybe there were a couple, 3 people to help that individual. For years, I was bowled with an Oldsmobile bowling league. So the bowling league, the women's bowling league, has been out there for years. Golf league has been out there more recently. And I remember something else they had, and this has changed, is the Oldsmobile Outdoor Club. I don't know if that's still in existence, but there was a time that they would provide medical services for that weekend up at Houghton Lake. because there were always some members of the staff and that were fishermen,
Mhm.
and they like to do ice fishing and they would take first aid supplies up with them. So there was kind of an extension of the medical department under certain circumstances, because I remember we would take first aid supplies with us on this women's club type of thing, on this all-day excursion to the beach.
Mhm.
What else? What other fun things do I remember over a period of years? I think from a medical standpoint, we knew one another a lot better than perhaps we did in the more recent years. There, we used to see, it seemed that we used to get together oftener, and the friends that you made way back then, it's interesting, they're still friends of mine today. Women that I met back in the late 40s are still very close friends of mine today. So, and I would imagine that's true of a lot of other returns.
Did the, maybe a peculiar question, but, and you had mentioned a little bit about it, in the early days, women were looked upon differently than in the later days, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Did that pose any peculiar problems other than the pregnancy business and those kinds of things that you?
I alluded to it with the fact that there were no women supervisors.
Okay.
I was the first woman supervisor in the medical department. And I think there again, it depends on the farsightedness of whoever's sitting in the personnel department.
Okay.
Whoever's in the personnel department and also the Times. Because in the 70s, certainly lawsuits became very prevalent
Yeah.
in industry and in people's rights. And that had not been true. When I think about initially going to work at the plant hospital and how few people were off work in plant related type of situations versus what I saw, how many were off later on.
There was a change.
There was a change. There was a tremendous change. We didn't. One thing that I have seen an improvement upon is more matching the employee to the job rather than just putting the employee on a job. I've seen a great improvement where I alluded earlier to standing on the tiptoes, and that really was true. But that's one of the best ways I know of to get some serious repetitive problems to the extremities. So progress has been made along that particular line. I think we'd have to look at a lot of this as why there wasn't as many injuries along certain lines early on was the volume wasn't there. They didn't need as many parts.
You think people were physically any better equipped or not?
You know,
these days or not?
Maybe they were. Think about it. We're talking about the 50s, and perhaps I would have to think they likely were than what they are today. It was more a working generation. It was more a generation that had come from the rural areas.
Yeah.
And now we have workers that come from all over, not so many rural. I think that if you were ever to track a group of employees versus another group, it would be an interesting experience to look at injuries from rural areas versus urban areas. I would imagine it'd be less. But the environment really made a lot of difference. Supervision became more sophisticated. More tools were available to them as far as being a supervisor. There was a supervisor seminar, and that was started, the medical aspect of that was started during Clarence Trombley's times. I remember he used to talk to the supervisors and the relationship to the medical department. I continued that. And I think it's a good relationship because it opens their eyes to what the medical department would expect. And they could ask questions because everybody had already been through the medical department, had some relationship with the medical department. But I go back again and I think about the insight of the original people that were in the Oldsmobile Medical Department. Like Dr. Gunnarsson was one. And he apparently took, as I understand it, I did not know the man, did a lot of family care.
Oh, really? So we actually brought members of the family?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I don't know if he ever made home visits. Dr. Steiner had a lot of insight. And Dr. Ralston. And I think it, as you see those pioneers out there into the relation, you saw a lot of neat things happening at Oldsmobile. I'd mentioned the employee assistance program, and I think that Oldsmobile's was one of the first. And the upward mobility of the nurses, the education of the nurses. It's all been encouraged by management within the medical department. So I think those are all pluses. And from the healthcare, I think that the healthcare has, over a period of years.
But overall that time, Marge, any one event or thing that you think was maybe most significant?
Jim, not that I can think of at this point in time.
Take me back a minute to the McCarthy thing. You had mentioned you went up the alleyway between the buildings. What happened? What were people doing?
Just standing there. Just standing there
Lined
looking at
up?
the man.
Lined
Yeah.
up on the.
And the wheels that, I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose, Mr. Wolfram. The important came through with him.
Did he get out to see any of the people?
They would have taken him over to the assembly area to see the cars made. That was, and since I wasn't in that area, I'm sure I went back to my particular area. But we did have the opportunity of seeing him. And there are a lot of dignitaries that I suppose would come out there to the assembly area that you wouldn't even be aware of. Some of the, I think about some of the dignitaries that would come through in the early days that wouldn't even speak to you. You'd speak to them and they wouldn't even acknowledge you.
Really?
And it's ironic when you think about it. But I guess that's different of managers. I remember the manager that I worked under at Plant 3, and his name was Del McCrae. And I don't think there was a more loved individual by everybody because he was such a down-to-earth individual. He knew everybody by name, and the hourly worker wouldn't mind asking him anything. It's kind of a nice management way of doing things because I think people want to be noticed. And I always used to say to the nurses when I take a new nurse out in the plant, remember you're in uniform, always have a smile on your face and say hello to everybody. You don't know them, but they know you're the nurse. And the nurses, as in my estimation, were a very important part of that environment. And the best tool was to be kind. It really was. It paid off. It paid off. And you had to like people too. You absolutely had to like people in order to do that type of a job. And I think as you look back on nurses that have stayed with the company over a period of years, they were people that enjoyed interacting with other people. So maybe that's the greatest significant event is the interaction of the employees. And it didn't matter if they were hourly, salary, or whomever. It's even today, you go places and I'm sure like anybody, I bump into somebody that I know. Maybe I can't call them by name, but I certainly can remember them in some way.
Sure.
Yeah, it's like a family, really. When I think about growing up with Oldsmobile, I always said, I think I said at the time I retired, it was like my other family.
Mhm.
And it's an awfully good feeling to leave when you leave a company, that you can leave it with feeling that that's part of family. Yeah, it really and the medical experience there. When I first went there, and I think a lot of my peers or my friends thought, what is she doing in a factory? And I thought for a while, what am I doing in a factory? Because after being in the military, a lot of these little cuts didn't mean much to me. But it was a tremendous experience. It was absolutely a tremendous experience. And if I were to do it again, I wouldn't want anything different. Yeah, isn't it? That's, I guess, where I'd have to end it. I wouldn't want to do anything different. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope this has been helpful.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, it has been, Marge.
Yeah.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent, so,
If I think, it's so hard to think of all of this.
I know. But as I tell people, if some other things come to mind and some other,
Mhm.
just get a chance to make a note of them, why we've had other people come back, we've had addend notes. that we've
Okay,
added.
good.
Spend another half hour, another hour,
Good,
whatever it
good.
takes, and add those to it.
Oh,
So
that's good.
it's
That's
just-
good.
it's just a thing that-
Because I would hope, this is off the record, isn't it? Is it still on the record? Okay, I would hope that
you know,
as nurses think of me, that they think that I was one that supported them, that I was one that supported education of both the nurses and the employees. Because it's that, and I think that was why it was a fun time. I think that's why it was a fun time is, things grow. In fact, Jim, when I was overseas, I went to a town that I had been at on a Christmas Eve in '44, where our train was buzzbound. And my daughter-in-law and I were riding this train, where we're staying in this town.
Sure.
And 40 years later, I had no concept that this was such a cosmopolitan city. It just, times change.
Sure,
When I think
sure.
about this span of time, when I went in nurses training before antibiotics came on the scene. And think about everything that's out there now that they're doing.
Technology change.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't mention that when I think back on is the treatment of amputations. That has changed. That has changed in the industry. Somebody amputate a finger, they may find the end of the finger, but we didn't likely it went in the trash can. Now they send it along, and maybe it can be reattached. Never thought about that.
Changing
Changes.
knowledge base.
Yes, and see the more sophisticated microscopes. So they can do all that fine.
Mhm.
More parts are being salvaged than used to be salvaged.
Interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. But it is, yeah. Thought
Well,
about
that's
that.
great.
So,
Well, that's excellent, Marge.
well, I hope this will be
that's great.
helpful. And if I do think of anything else, and I'm gonna go, I'll go back home and look and see if we got any more,
All right.
if I have those, negatives for those
Yeah,
pictures.
if you do, if
Yeah.
you don't, that's okay.
I got
We
some
can take
negatives or
notes,
something,
so.
and those may be the ones.
Yeah, could be. And they may exist in Wolfhouse's file or somebody else's file
Oh,
too.
you do
So
have that.
We have a pile of those negatives, which we don't even know what they are. So we've got a lot.
Mm.
Our task.
You mentioned when you were down in Florida, did you meet with these Oldsmobile people for their Oldsmobile Day where they get
Oh, no.
together?
We travel.
You traveled.
I spent 3 weeks bouncing around, drove something like 3,000 miles down in Florida, seeing people, and so we would see 1 or 2 people a day, sometimes 3 people a day. Just
Did you see
Sitting
Mike
at home.
Minnow or is he dead?
I did not see Mike Minnow, and I'll have to look on the list to see if he's still alive. I think he's dead.
Ken Ricks?
Penny Ricks, have not picked him up yet. Got Jack McGeown,
Oh, good.
but we'd like to get Kenny eventually because, of course, Ken was there for a long time too.
Yeah.
There's just so many people, and only the 2 of us kind of doing this, so it's just a slow
Mhm.
task. So to speak.
Mm. Well, if I can be of
Yeah.
any assistance,
Appreciate that.
if you come forth with anything,
Yeah.
any other pictures
Sure.
medical wise,
Appreciate that.